When the idea to reboot the MCU after Secret Wars was first being discussed, I was initially against it, because I felt like the MCU could still turn things around. They could fix things and they could get back on track. And honestly, I just didn't really want the MCU to end. But over time, I've definitely warmed up to this idea quite a bit. And the reason for that is, it's not a question of whether the MCU can fix itself or not. The question you have to ask yourself is, what is the benefit that Marvel gets from continuing on in the same continuity after Secret Wars? First of all, it has to be mentioned that Marvel is not DC. The DCEU was a franchise that had been run into the ground so much so that even when they were putting out good movies that audiences were actually quite enjoying, like Blue Beetle, the movies just still couldn't make any money because the DC name was actually starting to pull those movies down. Marvel is not that far past the point of no return. But is there actually a benefit to continuing on in the same continuity after Secret Wars? When Endgame had just come out and they were just finishing up the Infinity Saga, there was still definitely a huge benefit to continuing on with the same continuity, because Marvel was on top of the world, they just put out the biggest movie of all time, and so you definitely want to continue to ride that wave. But more importantly, they also had a bunch of characters still left over from the Infinity Saga that fans really cared about and wanted to see. In Endgame, Marvel did lose 3 of its biggest characters. They lost Steve, they lost Tony, they lost Natasha. But they still had the other half of the original 6, the Guardians of the Galaxy were still around, and then you had a lot of the newer characters that you introduced in Phase 2 and 3, like Wanda, Doctor Strange, Spider-Man, Black Panther. Of course, Chadwick Boseman ended up passing away, but at the time of Endgame, he was supposed to carry on as well. But when you start to look forward to Secret Wars, it's hard to imagine that very many of those characters that fans wanted to see are going to be continuing on past Secret Wars into another saga. Of course, the Guardians of the Galaxy are already pretty much out of the picture, with them kind of having their ending in Guardians Volume 3. But even for Thor, Chris Hemsworth has been playing this character all throughout the Infinity Saga. He's doing it again now in the Multiverse Saga. I know he said he wants to do Thor 5 because I think he doesn't want to finish on Love and Thunder, but him sticking around for an entire saga is hard to imagine at this point. But even for the newer characters like Wanda, Doctor Strange, Spider-Man, by the time Secret Wars comes out, which is going to be 2027, 2028 at the earliest, Elizabeth Olsen, Tom Holland, Benedict Cumberbatch, they would have been playing these characters for well over a decade at that point. So it's hard to imagine that many of them will also want to keep continuing to play these characters for much longer. And of course, the MCU has introduced new, fresh characters like Shang-Chi, Miss Marvel, Moon Knight, She-Hulk, Yelena, but most of these characters have shown up 1 time or 2 times max, and then we've never seen them again. So they've been so poorly integrated into the MCU that not many people really feel attached to these characters and are really interested in continuing to see them and follow their storylines. So once you do get to Secret Wars, you have to ask yourself, what is the benefit to really continuing on in the same continuity compared to the baggage that comes from having a continuity that is going to be 45 movies plus by the time this is over, 10 TV shows, and when you introduce all the multiversal movies like the X-Men films, the old Spider-Man films, at a certain point, the MCU just becomes this impenetrable thing to new audiences, and even for its existing audiences, it turns into a full-time job just trying to keep up with it. I feel like at that point, it just makes a lot more sense to start fresh, start from scratch. Don't have to worry about if something you're doing in this movie contradicts what happened 15 movies ago. Don't worry about how you can't use this character because in the continuity they're already dead. Just start from scratch. And when you do that, it also provides another really interesting opportunity. When the MCU first started off, Marvel didn't have access to a lot of their biggest characters. They had access to the core members of the Avengers, but Spider-Man was not in the MCU. They didn't have access to the X-Men or to the Fantastic Four. But you compare that to now, Marvel now has Spider-Man in the MCU. They've reacquired the rights to the X-Men, they've got the rights to the Fantastic Four back. So if Marvel decides to restart this whole thing from scratch. They would have a really cool opportunity to have a universe where they have the Avengers, the Fantastic Four, the X-Men, Spider-Man, pretty much all of Marvel's characters in their toolbox could now exist and play within the same world. Now, all of this leads to an important question. Will Marvel actually do a reboot? And I have to say, it doesn't look likely. And the reason for that is, Marvel is still introducing brand new characters into the MCU all the way up until Secret Wars. Of course, you have Blade, but more importantly, and the big red flag to me, is Fantastic Four. I can't imagine that Marvel would introduce the Fantastic Four to do one movie and then maybe have them show up in the 2 Avengers films, and that's it. They decide, that's all we get from these guys because we're rebooting and we need to start from scratch. I just can't see them bringing Pedro Pascal, Vanessa Kirby, Joseph Quinn, that entire stacked Fantastic Four cast to do one movie and then they pull the plug because they're rebooting the whole thing. If Marvel's going to do a reboot of any kind, it seems like they're going to be aiming for a soft reboot perhaps, which I'm not really on board for. I feel like if you're going to do a reboot, do it clean. Do the whole thing. Start from scratch. Don't do half reboot, half is not. But based on Marvel's plan for the future films, based on what they've got coming up, it doesn't seem like a full reboot is really on the table for them. But you guys let me know down in the comments, do you think the MCU should reboot after Secret Wars? And if you want to see my video on all the problems that Marvel has been facing since Endgame, click right here.